My name is Catherine Farrow, and on October 12th, I learned exactly how dangerous it is when a man with a trust fund and a thesaurus full of corporate buzzwords mistakes the architect for the janitor. He thought he was just deleting a line item to fund his latest vanity project. He had no idea he was signing the death warrant for his entire world. For 12 years, I was the ghost in the machine at Titan Equity Partners. Not just a ghost, the ghost. I built the machine. It was called the Helios System, and it was my life's work. To the traders and partners who made their fortunes using it, Helios was a miracle of convenience, a sleek interface that gave them real-time models of every asset, liability, and risk vector across our $50 billion portfolio. To me, it was a living map, a complex cartography of capital flows and contractual obligations. Every line of code, every algorithm was mine. It saw everything. It knew everything. It was the central nervous system of the firm, and I was its sole architect. My life outside of Titan was built on the same principles of precision and permanence. My apartment, filled with the scent of old wood and beeswax, was my sanctuary. I didn't collect art, I collected tools. My workbench was covered with antique cartography instruments, brass planimeters, steel ruling pens, rosewood protractors. I'd spend my evenings restoring them, feeling the satisfying weight of objects built to measure the world with unerring accuracy. Objects built to last. It was a tangible comfort against the ephemeral, jargon-filled world I inhabited during the day. Lately, that world had become embodied by one person, Dominic Price. Dominic was 32, handsome in the way of a department store mannequin, and possessed an ego inversely proportional to his competence. He hadn't earned his partnership, he'd married it. His father-in-law was a legacy board member, and Dominic moved through the firm with the unearned confidence of a man who had never faced a real consequence in his life. His fatal flaw wasn't just arrogance, but a profound, gnawing intellectual insecurity. He masked it with a fire hose of meaningless corporate speak. He never just did something. He would actionize our verticals. He didn't think about risk. He believed liquidity will operationalize itself. He was a plagiarist of thought, stealing phrases he'd overheard and deploying them with a smug certainty that betrayed he had no idea what they meant. He called me Kathy. Kathy, great work on those Q3 projections, he'd say, striding past my desk without making eye contact. I am not a Kathy. I am a Catherine. He knew this. It was a small, persistent erosion, a way of marking his territory by diminishing mine. It escalated. In a risk committee meeting, I presented a detailed analysis of his pet project, the hostile takeover of Miller Manufacturing. Miller was an old-line industrial firm from my hometown. My father had worked on their factory floor for 40 years, his hands stained with the same grease and loyalty that had built the company. To Dominic, it was just a target, a set of assets to be stripped. To me, it was a legacy. My Helios model showed, with terrifying clarity, that the debt load required for the acquisition would over-leverage the firm, leaving us dangerously exposed to even a minor market downturn. I had barely begun my presentation when Dominic waved a dismissive hand. "Thanks, Kathy," he said, a thin smile playing on his lips. "We appreciate the typically risk-averse analysis. We'll circle back to the hypotheticals later." He turned to the other partners. "Now, let's talk about how we can actionize this growth opportunity." I was silenced. My data, the pure, cold mathematics of the situation, was dismissed as a woman's nervous whim. The next week, he stopped by my terminal, leaning over my shoulder with an air of theatrical curiosity. I was running a deep diagnostic on Helios. "Still playing with those ancient-looking spreadsheets, Kathy?" he sneered, gesturing at the complex architecture on my screen. He saw a spreadsheet. He might as well have looked at a page of Sanskrit and called it a grocery list. The end came on a Tuesday. I was summoned to the main boardroom on the 40th floor, the one with the panoramic views of the city that made titans of industry feel like gods. Dominic was at the head of the long mahogany table, preening. He was presenting something called Project Apex, Streamlining for Growth. I already knew what was coming. The air in those rooms always gets thin before an execution. He clicked a remote, and a new slide appeared on the massive screen. It was stark white, with a single brutal bullet point in a clean corporate font. Synergistic headcount reductions, Treasury Analytics, redundant. Treasury Analytics was me. I was the entire department. Dominic gestured to the screen with a flourish. As part of our forward-thinking realignment, he began, his voice slick with rehearsed sincerity, we've identified certain legacy roles that can be absorbed by a new, more efficient software suite we're licensing. He looked directly at me, the smile not quite reaching his eyes. So, we'll be eliminating Catherine's position, effective immediately. A stunned silence fell over the room. Marcus Thorne, an old guard partner who'd been with the firm since its inception and who actually understood how things worked, leaned forward, his face etched with alarm. Dominic, that's unwise, he said, his voice a low rumble of dissent. CAT is the Treasury system. Helios is her architecture. Dominic chuckled, a sound like ice cubes rattling in an empty glass. It's a bookkeeper's role, Marcus, a glorified data entry clerk. The new software is more than capable. He then delivered the killing blow, the line that sealed his fate. Her severance is a necessary line item, a small price to pay to fund the Miller acquisition and propel us into the future. A line item. My life's work, my sleepless nights, the very scaffolding that held up his gilded world. A line item. A cold, still fury washed over me. It was so pure, so absolute, it felt like peace. I didn't say a word. I didn't plead or argue. I simply gathered my leather-bound notepad, met his smug gaze for a single long moment, and walked out of the room. The damning silence I left in my wake was louder than any scream. He had no idea that by making me a line item, he had just triggered an execution clause on a $5 billion debt instrument. He had just started a clock, and it was ticking down to zero. Panic is a useless emotion. It's a chaotic spasm of energy that accomplishes nothing. My response to being fired was the opposite. It was precision. I went home, not to rage or weep, but to allow the system I had built to function exactly as I had designed it. Years ago, when structuring a new $5 billion corporate bond, the TEP 2030 Global Bond, I had embedded a covenant. It was buried deep within the legalese of the indenture, a document so dense that I knew no one, least of all an intellectual tourist like Dominic, would ever read it. Section 9, subsection C4. It was called the Operational Continuity Clause. It was, in essence, a dead man's switch. It stipulated that the integrity and continuous operation of the firm's proprietary risk management system, Helios, was material to the bondholder's security. It further named the key system architect, my legal name, Catherine Farrow, as essential personnel for that operation. My termination without a board-approved, technically vetted successor constituted a material breach of the covenant. It was a technical default, a default that gave the bond trustee the right to demand immediate and full repayment of the entire $5 billion principal. I had built this system with one hidden feature, a fail-safe to protect the firm from a man exactly like Dominic Price. My termination, processed by an automated HR system that Dominic himself had championed for its efficiency, was the trigger. The moment my employee status changed to terminated, the switch was flipped. I didn't have to lift a finger. The machine was already doing its work. That evening, the chaos of my professional life felt a world away. My apartment was a haven of order. The air was filled with the smoky, peaty aroma of the single-origin Lapsang Souchong tea I was brewing. I watched the steam curl from the kettle, using a digital thermometer to ensure the water was precisely 195 degrees Fahrenheit before pouring it over the leaves. A perfect brew requires patience and precision. So does revenge. I took my cup to my workbench. Under the warm glow of a brass lamp, I picked up a 19th century planimeter I was restoring. It was a beautiful instrument of German silver and steel, designed to measure the area of an irregular shape on a map. I unscrewed the tracer arm, my fingers moving with practiced ease, and began polishing the intricate gears with a soft cloth. The cool, solid weight of the tool in my hand was a grounding force. It was real. It was an object of purpose, of craft. It represented everything Dominic was not. I felt a cold, quiet satisfaction settling deep in my bones. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't hoping the call would come. I knew it would. I had mapped the terrain, I had built the instruments, and I had set the course. All I had to do now was wait for the ship I had built to deliver its cargo. The next morning, at 9:01 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the detonation occurred. Across every terminal at Titan Equity Partners, on the trading floor, in the partners' offices, in the back-office cubicles, a single stark message bloomed into existence, overriding everything else on the screen. It came from the bond trustee, a massive, faceless banking conglomerate that existed only to enforce contracts. Notice of Debt Acceleration TEP 2030, Global Bond $5 billion, a material breach of covenant, Section 9, subsection C I4s, has occurred. Per the terms of the indenture, the full principal is hereby declared immediately due and payable. Payment in full is required within 24 hours to avoid insolvency proceedings. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic, $5 billion. The firm had, at most, $500 million in liquid cash on hand. The rest was tied up in illiquid private equity deals, real estate, and complex derivatives. All assets tracked, valued, and managed by Helios. And without me, Helios was a black box. The slick, user-friendly interface was still there, but the back end, the living core of the system, was uninterpretable. I hadn't locked anyone out. I didn't need to. The system was simply too complex for anyone else to understand. It was like leaving the keys to a fighter jet in the ignition for a man who only knew how to ride a bicycle. He could sit in the seat, but he couldn't make it fly. The calls for margin from our prime brokers would have started within minutes. The entire financial architecture of Titan Equity Partners was predicated on the stability that bond provided. With it called in, every other credit line, every other loan, every other financial agreement was now in jeopardy. The firm was not just in crisis, it was in a death spiral. It would be insolvent by sundown. Marcus Thorne later described the scene in Dominic's office to me with a grim satisfaction. Dominic, he said, was a man utterly broken. His carefully curated facade of smooth, patrician competence had shattered, revealing the panicked, insecure child beneath. His $6,000 suit was rumpled, his tie askew, and a sheen of cold sweat glistened on his forehead. He was screaming into his phone, his voice a raw, ugly thing. "What do you mean you can't stop it?" he shrieked at the firm's lead banker. "Unwind it! Tell them it was a mistake." Marcus said he could hear the tinny, dispassionate voice from the phone's speaker. "Dominic, we've reviewed the indenture. The covenant is ironclad. You triggered the default. There's nothing to negotiate. You have to pay." He slammed the phone down and immediately dialed another, pacing his office like a caged animal. The calls all went the same way. To the lawyers, to the accountants, to the trustee, the answer was always the same. The covenant is ironclad. You triggered the default. You have to pay. What he didn't understand about the system he had so blithely dismissed was its elegant, brutal simplicity. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a mathematical certainty. A contract is just a social algorithm. Input A, my termination, produces output B, financial annihilation. He had provided the input. The system was simply delivering the contractually obligated result. He, the man who wanted to actionize our verticals, was being actionized by a single clause he had been too arrogant and too lazy to read. By 3 p.m., the firm was hemorrhaging. Marcus Thorne, exercising an emergency charter clause, had seized operational control from the sputtering, incoherent Dominic and convened an emergency board meeting. The Titans were terrified. Their personal fortunes, their reputations, their entire professional lives were hours from being wiped out. Dominic was in the boardroom, slumped in his chair at the head of the table. He was pale, his skin pasty, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered rat. The expensive suit that usually looked like a second skin now hung on him. Ill-fitting and absurd. My phone rang at 3:15. It was Marcus. "Kat," he said, his voice strained, "we need you." "I'm no longer an employee of the firm, Marcus," I replied calmly. "Please," he said, and the single word was stripped of all pretense. It was a raw plea. "Name your price. Just come." I arrived at 3:45. I had taken my time. I didn't wear one of my functional dark work suits. I wore a sharply tailored dress in a deep burgundy, a color of power and blood. I walked into that boardroom not as an employee, but as a principal. The room fell silent. Every eye was on me. I let my gaze sweep over the panicked faces of the board members before landing finally on Dominic. He flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "You seem to be having a liquidity event," I said, my voice cool and even. It echoed in the funereal quiet of the room. I walked to the head of the table and plugged my personal tablet into the room's projector. An image of a dense legal document appeared on the main screen, a single section highlighted in yellow. Section 9, subsection CF. I read it aloud. to ensure operational continuity and protect the bondholder's security interest in the firm's stable management of assets. The termination of the designated key system architect, Catherine Farrow, without a board-approved and vetted successor, shall constitute a material breach of this covenant. Dominic shot to his feet, a flicker of his old bluster returning. This is insane. You planned this. You sabotaged us. I turned to him, and the polite mask I had worn for 12 years fell away. I fixed him with a stare so cold I felt the heat leave my own body. No, Dominic. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a shard of glass. I didn't sabotage the firm. I built a failsafe to protect the firm from catastrophic incompetence. I paused, letting the words hang in the air before delivering the final surgical strike. You were the catastrophe. The look on his face when he finally realized his mistake was everything I had hoped for. It wasn't anger, it was the dawning, hollowed-out horror of a man who has just understood, in the most complete and public way possible, that he is a fool, that his entire sense of self was a fragile lie, and it had just been shattered by the woman he'd dismissed as a bookkeeper. I turned back to the ashen-faced board. "The trustee will listen to me," I said. "I can halt the acceleration, but it will cost you." Marcus Thorne found his voice first. "What do you want, Kat?" "I don't want my job back," I stated, my gaze sweeping across the desperate men who held the fate of the company in their hands. "I want Dominic Price's entire partnership position, his capital accounts, his carry, his bonus pool, his voting rights, all of it, forfeited to me. I will take his seat on the board, effective immediately." There was no negotiation, there was no debate. Before I had even finished speaking, heads were nodding. Facing the alternative, total ruin, bankruptcy, lawsuits that would last a decade, my price was a bargain. The firm's general counsel was already on his phone, summoning a team of lawyers to draw up the transfer documents. They forced Dominic to sign them right there at the table. I watched the pen tremble in his hand as he signed away his career, his status, his father-in-law's legacy. He, the man who saw people as line items, had just become one himself, a multi-million-dollar liability, zeroed out to balance the books. When it was done, he was a ghost, a non-entity. The firm's head of security, a man Dominic had probably never even bothered to learn the name of, appeared at the door. "Mr. Price," he said, his voice devoid of any deference, "we'll escort you out." I watched him pack his desk. It didn't take long. A few family photos, a set of golf balls, and a heavy, ostentatious paperweight from the Wharton School of Business. He carried it all out in a single sad cardboard box, a walking cliché of corporate failure. His reputation, once his most valuable asset, had been vaporized in the space of an afternoon. 2 weeks later, I sat in my new office, Dominic's old office. It had a much better view. From my desk, I authorized a bridge loan from the firm's capital reserves, a small fraction of what I now controlled, to Miller Manufacturing. The deal saved the company, the factory, and the jobs of 3,000 people in my hometown. My father called me, his voice thick with an emotion I hadn't heard in years. A few days after that, I arranged for a courier. Dominic was sitting in a coffee shop in Midtown, trying and failing to network with old contacts who would no longer take his calls. The courier delivered a small, flat package. Inside, he found the front page of the Millersville Gazette. The headline read, "Titan Equity Partner Catherine Farrow Saves Local Manufacturer." There was a large photo of me shaking hands with the factory foreman, a man who had worked alongside my father for 30 years. Tucked inside the newspaper was a single sheet of my heavy, cream-colored personal stationery. On it, I had written a short note in black ink. "Some of us build things. Some of us are just line items.